In 1959, toy entrepreneur Ruth Handel changed her life forever. Her new product, a doll named after her daughter Barbara, would become one of the biggest toy franchises in history. Despite the critics and the problems, a recent Oscar-winning movie adaptation has won over a whole new generation of fans that guarantees this toy is going nowhere. So, in this episode, I want to know, how is Barbie still relevant? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. Joining me from the faculty today is Jon Mitchell, an Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of East Anglia. He's interested in late 20th century US culture with a particular interest in the representation of gender and sexuality. Welcome back, Jon.
Hello, welcome.
Great to have you back on the podcast. I think the last time you joined us was at Christmas, wasn't it?
Christmas movies, yes.
Yeah,
such a delight.
Good episode. And on that note, talking of Christmas movies, I'm also delighted to be joined on this episode by Vaughn Joy, a PhD candidate at UCL, researching mid-century Hollywood politics and their cross-section through a case study on Christmas films. Welcome back to the podcast, Vaughn.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you back. I think the last time you were on, we discussed the Oscars in quite some detail, and I loved that episode.
That was so fun. It was such a good time.
It was good, and I'll link to that in the show notes as well, because we talked a lot in that about representation and gender and how that's reflected at the Oscars, so that may well come up again. But as the only woman on our panel today, did you ever have a Barbie doll?
I did not, actually. I think my older sister did at one point, but my mom was not a fan of the doll and the things that she represented culturally. So interesting to be having this conversation. But as a non-initiated person observing the Barbie phenomenon, it's a fascinating cultural thing, isn't it? And as you say, as a woman in this world, thinking about Barbie and what she means and what she reflects about our culture and societal expectations for women, it's fascinating. Even though I never had a doll, I wonder how differently I would think if I did actually have a Barbie doll.
Yeah, and I know I singled you out, Vaughn, because Barbie is typically aimed at little girls. I mean, but Jon, did you ever have a doll or a Barbie doll?
Obviously, I had the British version of G.I. Joe, which is Action Man, which is basically the same thing. But my sister had a Cindy, which was the British version and cheaper version of Barbie, I believe. But I always loved her. She had a thing called Girls' World, which you can get a Barbie version of. It's basically a head. Yeah, the hair grows and you can do things with it, head and shoulders, and you can do things with it, mess around with the hair and hairstyles and makeup and stuff on them.
Well, the hair actually grows.
You press a button and it kind of comes out or retracts. Good 70s, early 80s technology there. I think, so.
From a commercial point of view, that's genius, right? Because presumably that hair is perishable, so the amount of refills those parents had to go through.
I don't think this was refillable. I think it was just one long strand of it that you could do things with should you choose to.
Yeah. I mean, you obviously talked about that and Cindy and even, the boys' versions like G.I. Joe and Action Man. And I think to start, I'm keen to understand why you both think that of all the dolls that have come before and since, what was it about Barbie in particular that just hit with people?
I think the film does it, doesn't it? It's that generally dolls before Barbie were infants, they were babies, and it was about that kind of preparing young girls for the future possibility of kind of motherhood, and I kind of love the anarchy where they smash them all up in the beginning of the film. It's kind of so much fun in many ways, but I think it also kind of speaks to. I mean, it's 59 when Barbie comes out, as you said, and it kind of speaks to, I suppose, certain ways of thinking about gender in the 1950s as well, which was largely for both males and females a kind of compromised position. So for, I suppose, you had that idea of kind of women being glamorous, sexualized, which comes from, way back from the 10s, 20s with actresses like Clara Bow that are kind of moving through Rita Hayworth and Marilyn Monroe into the 50s. So you've got that sense of glamour and sexuality and kind of looks, which obviously Barbie picks up. But then you've got also that kind of the domesticity and the domestic world as well, which Barbie can be turned towards also. So it's kind of working, to me anyway, working on that kind of compromise position of being glamorous but not too glamorous, but also kind of involving that kind of domestic space and domestic world, Barbie the nurse, Barbie the carer, Barbie, the annual lover, whatever it might be. So I think it speaks in that way to kind of the other aspects of gender that were going on in the 1950s around femininity and ideals of femininity.
I fully agree with you. As you say, dolls were much more about like nurturing and preparing young girls for motherhood. And there wasn't really an idea of that girl who was playing with a doll having a future, even with that doll. Like, the child was her future. She herself didn't get one. And I think it was really powerful to have Barbie as an adult figure, showing that girls can be more than just a mother or even a vacant figure almost, with the baby doll being the important part of the imaginary play. I think that's a really powerful kind of message for girls. And I do also think that there was a very keen sense of timing for Mattel, not just with the gender roles in 59, but also as part of the Cold War. It was ripe time for escapism and imaginary play, being in the Cold War. You get her dream house in 62, and then in 65, she's an astronaut, like right in line with the space race. Like, there are a lot of things that are just very keen timing that I think extended her popularity through the 60s. You get Barbie commenting on the civil rights movement in 68, I think, with the Christie doll. Like, there are a lot of very important moments in American history that Barbie was reflecting and speaking to right at the same time, or throughout her first decade. And I think that's what really kind of solidified her as this now American figure, not just a child's toy.
I think that's great as well, kind of different ways that she is kind of hitting on kind of historical moments, actually in terms of the space race, before the historical moment as well. And I think something that just cropped up to me as well is that this is also the kind of the period kind of the ascendancy of the teenager as well. Yeah. So it's a way for kind of little girls, as you say, Vaughn, to see themselves in a kind of a future self, to see themselves kind of getting older. And we all know that young kids always love kind of older kids, and kind of love attaching themselves to kind of the vision of kind of growing up and being older. So
I think there's also a really important part of that, as you're saying, and in the 50s specifically, when you have so many young kids with like duck and cover in schools thinking about their own mortality, the idea that they do get to grow up and they get to see themselves as a Barbie figure eventually, I think is a really important, powerful thing. We'll talk about all of the issues of that idealized vision of her in a moment, I'm sure, but just the fact of, in the 1950s, in this peak Cold War moment, nuclear tensions, fears of mortality in young children, there's something important about being able to envision yourself as an older person, an older iteration of yourself.
I mean, do you think that, from everything you've said, that with Barbie, it was, for its time, it was quite an innovative doll, and it was just the right thing at the right time? Because we've seen a lot of imitations and a lot of very similar things come out since. I mean, so was Barbie just the first?
Well, the German doll she's based upon, or whatever it is, the first, isn't it? Kind of the German sex doll she's based upon. Well, not sex, but kind of sexualized doll. I think it's also a genius in marketing and a genius of business practice. I mean, and it's a business practice that we still use today and kind of probably use even more so. So I'm thinking that, you buy a basic unit and then you can add to it and you can kind of grow it. So you're buying a basic product, but you still have to go out and buy extra bits. But at the same time, we love, as human beings, we love customizing. Yeah, we love customizing things. I mean, the whole mobile phone world is kind of really tapped into that. But I'm thinking of a game like Fortnite, hey, give the game away free and then charge everybody for the customizations. I mean, that's the model that kind of Barbie, I'm not going to say started because I don't know enough about business practices, but seems to have really capitalized upon from kind of 59 onwards, is that kind of customizable aspect of Barbie.
The original Barbie, do all of those sort of different versions of Barbie have to exist because the original is actually quite problematic, because it's this kind of all-American sort of poster image of what an American woman should look like, right? And actually it's not realistic and it's not very appropriate.
Yeah, I can see that argument for sure. Let's not beat around the bush. Entirely unrealistic proportions could not possibly exist. The closest approximation to her, if Barbie were a real person, her measurements would be, I think, 38, 18, 34 for bust, waist, hips. And the closest real person would be probably Vera Ellen, from the dancer and actress from the 1940s and 1950s. She's in White Christmas. Her waist at the peak of her fame was between 17 and 21 inches. So that waist is probably the only real life kind of approximation we could get. But Vera Ellen was also 5'4", and Barbie's measurements, she would be 5'9". So entirely unrealistic. A problem, for sure. But she was also in this dichotomy of things that women could be. And on one hand, physical attraction and ideal body standards, even if they are unattainable, was the kind of image that got her in the door, I would say. And then also she had this really powerful social message of women can be anything they want to be as long as they are beautiful, but they can be all of these different careers. They can do things that they want to do. So I think it's always and forever going to be a trade-off, as it is also kind of with being a woman. There are things that you are expected to do and be and whatever in any space that you occupy. And I think Barbie is both a representation of that and also a victim of it.
I think that's a nice way of putting it, kind of representation and victim. And perpetrator, I think, as well. Because that's one thing I was thinking. I mean, that Barbie can do all these things, and the message is great. It's slightly problematic and neoliberal, but it is still, a positive message. So she can be an astronaut, she can be a nuclear physicist, she can be a naval admiral, she can be a firefighter. As you say, Vaughn, as long as she's thin-waisted, tall, busty, and beautiful, doing all these things. So, as you say, there's a trade-off of a payoff. But I think, as you say, it's the looks that kind of get her through the door in the first place. Kind of those idealized kind of looks.
Are all these different versions of Barbie good enough in sort of tackling that problem, or does there need to be a more body positive sort of design to Barbie or to other dolls? And I guess my thought here is that if those dolls exist, I don't know of them, so why haven't they been successful? Do people want that aspiration that Barbie represents? There's a lot in there to unpack, I realise, but I can't quite understand how such a problematic and unrealistic body image that's portrayed by Barbie was so successful.
I think you talk about the success, the kind of popularity. I mean, I don't have any statistics, but I mean, are we seeing just really good advertising here, compared to what people are actually playing with? And the other thing I think the way we often think about Barbie is very much as adults, and the way that Barbie is advertised in many ways is the way that adults think children play with things. And I think weird Barbie in the film is probably closer to the way that children really play with these things. I mean, I remember from my own childhood, cousins and friends, sisters and stuff. I mean, Barbie was always kind of had her hair chopped off, always was kind of drawn on with felt tip pen, and lying naked in spread eagle, kind of in different positions, kind of on the side of the bath. Do you know what I mean? So the way that we see Barbie represented in the box and in the kind of advertisement is not always necessarily the way that kids play with them, and they play with them and they kind of interspersed them with other kind of storylines and other kind of ways of thinking as well as boys we do with kind of G.I. Joe or Action Man or whatever, or our own Barbies, whatever. So I think how kids play and how we see kind of Barbie represented is not always necessarily kind of lined up.
I fully agree with what you were saying there, John. The idea of how children actually play with Barbie is really important to consider in the conversation of how much of a negative impact is Barbie having on children. And there have been countless kind of psychological studies and trials trying to get to that point that have all concluded kind of contradictory information, because a young girl's body image is never going to be because of one specific doll. It's going to be because of a much wider environmental and nurturing and whatever kind of situation that she is having, and it's going to be individual to every child. So maybe there are some that really do take to heart the impossible waste, and maybe some don't notice it at all. So I don't think that we can contribute all of kind of society's ills around body image to Barbie. But there definitely are some, and it is reflecting much larger kind of problems in our society about what a woman should look like. I do think, again, I've been thinking about this a lot in the last couple of days of preparing for this podcast, that it is really contradictory and difficult to kind of talk about this, because Mattel has been trying. In 97, they widened her waist, and then in the early 2000s, a lot of these psychological studies and like evidence-based kind of conclusions about Barbie started coming out. So they introduced fuller ranges of body proportions. There are now 9 different body types that you can get of Barbie since 2016. In 97, they also introduced a disabled Barbie who was in a wheelchair, and a disabled high school student who does use a wheelchair pointed out that that specific Barbie couldn't get into the dream house, into the lift. So Mattel responded by making the dream house accessible. Like, they are responding when things come up. And I think that that's an important point about changing standards of the woman's body over time. Things that were acceptable in the 50s are definitely not acceptable anymore when we think about women's bodies and how we talk about them or represent them, all of those things. So I think Mattel is trying in the same way, again, that kind of women are trying. And I think the film reflects that Barbie is feeling what women feel in the real world, these impossible expectations, even though she is like the quote unquote perfect woman, even she is suffering these standards. And John can definitely speak more about that.
I was looking at Mattel's UK webpage. I mean, and overwhelmingly most of the Barbies are the typical waisted kind of size Barbies, all with long hair. Clearly, if you're Barbie, you can't have short hair. But there are pages that they have there about inclusion, and they have a whole video on kind of Down syndrome Barbie and the importance of that representation, and of, as you say, Vaughn, of listening to their customers and adjusting their products. I think that's all great. Overwhelmingly, though, the kind of page is very typical, and most of the images are of, it's hard to make these definite positive assertions these days, but of what seem to be cisgendered girls playing with Barbie dolls. Yeah, overwhelmingly. But it is there, and Mattel are trying, and there are different, lots of different ethnicities now with Barbie, lots of different cultural references, lots of different body sizes, and it's early days, and probably we need more, but there are, as you say, Barbie in a wheelchair, Barbie with Down syndrome, and so on and so forth. So,
I think one of the issues that I have with Mattel is, and maybe the film, as we'll discuss in a second, is part of the answer to this, but you sort of touched on it, Vaughn, in that it feels quite reactive on their part. There's a particular response that's needed, and so they give it, and okay, fine, that's it's commendable, at least, that they're listening and responding. But a company and a product that has that much influence, should they not be leading that dialogue and leading by example?
The one thing I would say to that is I fully agree that they could do an even better job with acting first rather than reacting. I do think, though, that people will always find a reason to criticize a woman's body. And Barbie is no different. And I do think that there is just an endless supply of complaints that can be made, that Mattel will always be responding to some level of criticism with the way that our society kind of surveils women's bodies and constantly is commenting on them in some way. So I agree that Mattel could do more to anticipate some changes probably, or even encourage some changes. But I also think it's going to be a losing battle either way. They can't win that one.
I think as well, we are kind of, like we're drawn to kind of customizing. We are slightly drawn to ideals as well. And I'm thinking about the way the male body is becoming increasingly idealized, especially kind of the gay male body has become idealized in the same ways that kind of not exactly the same ways that women's bodies have, and obviously not for as long. But so we are constantly drawn to kind of ideals, and ideals sell, I suppose. Ideal bodies sell could be better than real bodies do. So,
and now kind of coming on to the film, I think this is where I think Barbie as a brand has really sort of pivoted a little bit, in terms of how it represents itself, and because the film was huge. The film, it wasn't just speaking to Barbie fans. It really transcended beyond that in a way that no other sort of film or TV adaptation of Barbie has ever done. So what, in terms of how it represents gender and sexuality and these sort of ideals that we were speaking about, John, how has the movie sort of changed that for Barbie?
Do you know something? I am terrified about talking about this movie in terms of gender. I think this film is more about gender than it is about sexuality. It has some nods to sexuality, it's much more about gender. I'm terrified about talking about this film because every time I think about something, I can think of a counterexample that proves me not wrong, but incomplete. And I think this film is so self-aware of gender and traffics wonderfully in stereotypes, which it constantly ambiguously undercuts all over the shop. As soon as we start making claims about gender, it's like, oh, we're not quite right there. I mean, and we can read things in sort of, as we can with all films, but for me, the filmmakers seem to be aware of this in Barbies, and that they can read. And so to me, Barbie is a celebration of women's lives. It's also a critique of anti-feminism. It's also, I think, a critique of simplistic feminism as well, because of the way that. So I suppose to me, it's a critique of stereotypes. It's a critique of simplicity, thinking about gender in simplistic ways. To give an example of these kind of multiple readings, there's a wonderful scene where Ken first discovers patriarchy, and of course, because he's a doll, he discovers it in the most literal sense. And you have a montage where he goes to, I can't remember, it's some kind of business first, and he wants to become some kind of high-powered job. He said, well, I'm a man, surely I can have this job. And then he goes to a hospital, you can't perform an appendectomy. No, just one, can't I be but he has a certain kind of ideal about being a doctor as well. Where's the white coat? You can't be a doctor if you're a woman, the woman's saying, I am a doctor, And then obviously he realizes he can't even do beach, which I think is a wonderful parody of Ken, kind of, I do beach. And we can read that, to me, we can read that in two ways. One, we can read it as a critique of kind of male egotism, that just because you're a man, you can do things, that gives you a right to do things. But I think we can also read it in some ways of a critique of simplistic feminism, which is that men also have to put in work, also have to kind of learn, also have to work hard and be things. They can't just become it just because they're men. So the film does that with everything and has this kind of vacillating kind of critique around simplistic stereotypes. Even the most wonderful bit where Gloria is making that fantastic speech about the difficulties of being a woman, it's a critique very much of patriarchy, but I see it also as a critique of feminism and the expectations sometimes of feminists that women have to be more and do more constantly. So again, it reminds me of the kind of the yodeling scene in Mars Attacks, because suddenly this is the way they're going to deprogram everybody. So it goes from this this serious moment to this very silliness, because it is a silly film in all the good ways. It is a film about toys at the end of the day. and the deprogramming gets kind of the misandry of the deprogramming gets kind of increases, in the cutscenes, and again, so it's that kind of, it's not simplistically, kind of representing a kind of one-dimensional kind of men are bad feminism. It's much more complicated what it's doing with gender and the way it's playing with stereotypes. So as I said, I'm kind of terrified. I've just made a comment there, but I'm terrified that everything I've just said is probably can be twisted in other ways. So I don't know. But yeah, so things are ambiguous. I think there's a constant parody of everything's, the simplicity of gender representations. Barbie is a doll and her world is two-dimensional. Ken is a doll, his world is two-dimensional, and their takes on the world. Barbie's shocked to discover that, the Gloria's daughter isn't, overly enthused about, and happy about all the sacrifices and representation that Barbie is, and it actually has quite a negative representation. So the film is very clever in what it's doing.
I would just applaud that. I think that was a very good way of putting the kind of contradictions that are within the film. That, like I was saying with just the doll, it's really hard to voice these things because she is multiple things. She is problematic, but she's also super progressive. And I think the film captures that kind of really difficult kind of balance that Barbie herself holds. And it's not incredibly feminist. It's not the most feminist film that has ever been made, probably, but it did make $1 billion. And I think we cannot discount the idea that it reached such a wide audience that never would have seen this film if it were further to the left or more feminist in some people's eyes or any of these things. If it didn't have the same kind of contradictions that the Barbie doll had of being beautiful to get in the door to tell young girls that they can have careers, I don't think the film would have been as successful. I think it also had to make some sacrifices and made them in excellent comedic ways that are satire in themselves, but still made some of those sacrifices. To be a few steps further than the current limit of feminism in mainstream, very successful films, also be from women's perspectives, about women's perspectives, and celebrating women's lives. I really loved the way that you put that, John. And also reach the audience that it did. I think there's a compromise there. That it doesn't have to be the most extreme aggressive feminism or commentary on gender and sexuality to still be a very successful one that opens some eyes that wouldn't have seen it before.
Vaughn, I wonder if you think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm going to just ask the question here. The success of the film is actually reflective of just a broader shift in attitude amongst, I'm going to say Americans, because it was an American film made for American audiences. But when you look at everything, because there's been many Barbie films and TV series in the past, and they've all lent into this very two-dimensional Barbie sort of stereotype. The film has done something very different. Is it because now was the right time for that film? Would it have worked 20 years ago, for instance?
This film, as it is, I don't think so. I don't think that this would have worked 20 years ago. I do think that this is a product of our moment, definitely. I think the Barbie brand has been building up to this. I will say that first. That there's a TV series called Barbie Vlog, where she's like a YouTuber, pretty much. And she talks about like actual serious societal issues of like mental health and racism and dealing with isolation and loneliness. And those are not really topics that you would expect Barbie to be commenting on, but she has been since 2015. And I think that's very important for thinking about where the brand was going and how it got to this film that was made last year of actually engaging wider societal things. For about the first 50 years or so of Barbie's existence, she was pushing the idea that women can do more in the workspace. They can be career women. They can, from 92 onwards, be president if they want to. And there has been a gradual progression, in my opinion, of Barbie becoming more progressive and reaching wider kind of horizons for what women can do in society. And I don't think that in 2003, this film would have had the same impact, because the brand and also just America in general weren't at the point where we could fully visualize Barbie Land as a real place, as a real existing place with a female president, with a female Supreme Court system. Like, I think it took time.
I mean, America is still ideologically a pretty divided place.
Well, yes, for sure.
Were you surprised to see the film do as well as it did? Because $1 billion, you know, even by today's standards, is no easy feat.
I think everybody was shocked. And I think that is, one, quite sad that we were shocked in that way, that a female-led, female-produced, female-directed, and mostly written film from, the female perspective, about the female perspective. I think that shocked everybody, that it surpassed $1 billion. And I do think that the Barbenheimer trend helped it a little bit. Definitely not as much as that trend helped Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer definitely did far better because of its pairing with Barbie than Barbie did because of its pairing with Oppenheimer. But I do think that the film stands on its own. It's funny. It's well produced. It is emotional. It offers, again, a couple steps past mainstream accepted feminist ideas, especially in 2023, when we are so ideologically divided. And I think it's a real triumph to have been able to do that.
I think it's also fun. I agree with everything you say there, Vaughn. It's also fun because it has so many. It's so simple on its face, but it has so many layers. You definitely need to see it more than once, you know. And it's a film. It's a film that's poking, you know, the anti-feminist bear as well. So, you know, I wonder how many people went to see it to get annoyed at it. You know what I mean? As well, you know, as you say, kind of pairing it with Oppenheimer. I mean, we were almost playing out this kind of ideological battles, you know, or gender battles there between the two films. So, you know, it was well placed. It was of its time, and it is a remarkably well made, well written, engaging film.
I mean, you talk about the gender battles between the two films, and I guess the ultimate judgment, you could say, critically at least, was the Oscars, where Oppenheimer won out and Barbie famously was snubbed in certain categories. And I mean, does that still tell a story that there's, I mean, despite the success of Barbie, there's still some disparity there?
Yes, that's why we need Barbie. That's what Barbie's all about. There's huge disparities, and these are really complicated issues, you know, that one film cannot solve, just like one doll cannot possibly solve.
I agree with you fully. I think it just shows how much we need more films like Barbie, more films about women and their experiences, diverse gender experiences. We could really widen this horizon a lot more than it is at the moment. And I do think, again, that Barbie is a step in that right direction. I have many views on Oppenheimer that I am equally as terrified to voice as Jon was talking about gender in Barbie. And I don't think, as I believe I said on our previous podcast, Liam, that the Oscars are the official arbiter of what good art is, or what other films should be made. And it's a shame that the Oscars are used as kind of funding agents to say, like, look, we won an Oscar for this. We should make more films like Oppenheimer about smart white men.
Actually, the history of Hollywood shows not, because as soon as you start making films that were successful, they become less and less successful because of the repetition. So,
yeah, it's a short window there.
Very difficult. Yeah.
Do you think that ultimately, like, this is about, you know, because the Oscars, yeah, it's only one, you know, it's only one group of people's sort of opinion there, and it's become maybe more significant than perhaps it really is reflective of. But you know, the Oscars still are a good opportunity to gain some prestige and credibility in certain ways. And does this sort of all kind of feed in to what really is the big problem here, and you know, I think you both sort of touched on it at certain points throughout this discussion, is it's the marketing and the PR. You know, it's not necessarily about the doll itself. It's about how they sell it, and what that comes to represent, and the messaging that Mattel choose to spin from that.
Well, I think the film kind of pushes Mattel's hand a little bit as well. I mean, there is diversity in Mattel, but I mean, if you look at the Barbies in the film, I mean, you got somebody like Sharon Rooney. You know, there isn't a Barbie who has that kind of female figure in the kind of the toy world. Obviously, Harry Neff is playing, you know, a transgender Barbie, and again, we don't really see that in the toy world. So in some ways, the film is pushing Mattel's hand a little bit here. And again, especially around kind of around the complexities of gender. I love the end of the film because Barbie gets out of the car and she's kind of slightly power dressed, and she's in wherever it is, some big American city. You know, you got all the tall buildings, and you expect it to be a bit like the end of Working Girl in the 80s, you know, that sense of, you know, she's gone to get her office, she's gone to get a high-powered job. But she goes in and she's gone to the gynecologist. It's like, whoa, that was kind of that was a different kind of take. So, yeah, Barbie can be anything, but she can also go to the gynecologist. But if you have to think about it, it's been pointed out all the way through the film, Barbie has no genitals. She has no female anatomy beyond the, you know, a basic shape. So this is almost speaking to kind of trans issues as well, in kind of very subtle kind of ways. I mean, she's gone to the gynecologist. Why? You know, it leaves us dangling there. So there's a sense about questions about what is a female body, what can female bodies do, and, you know, what should female bodies be. So it's a wonderful open. So in some ways, I think the film is pushing, as I said, pushing Mattel's hand in thinking about how in the 21st century, in whatever 2023, 24, you know, people are thinking about these issues, especially parents buying dolls for their children. So
it feels to me like the film, you know, from everything we've said, is because Mattel have clearly had a lot of involvement in the film and the certain, you know, creative direction. But the film itself kind of sits a little bit on the fringe of that whole Barbie brand, because of how it presents itself and the audiences that it attracts. Was that very deliberate, though, do you think, as a way of kind of not really rebranding Barbie, but it was a very targeted campaign almost? And I would say the film was part of a marketing campaign to sort of maybe change the dialogue around Barbie and to kind of reposition Barbie as something that's very, or someone that's very progressive in today's world. It really kind of has moved her forward into the 21st century in a way that maybe other content hasn't for Barbie.
I could see that for sure. I think that would mean that Mattel is trying to act before reacting. That they are at least open to new perspectives on Barbie prior to being criticized for certain portrayals. So that's, again, I think they are trying, as much as I don't really want to give like corporations too much credit. I'll say
there are limits.
Trying.
There are limits.
But I do agree with John that the film also kind of forced Mattel's hand. I don't think Greta Gerwig was really taking everything Mattel had to say and putting it on film. She definitely had say in that, of like, we're going to make this type of film with this type of message, and you are either on board or you are not. And she worked with them, but again, it's kind of give and take of like, how far can we take this in being progressive while also being acceptable in mainstream Hollywood outputs? And it struck a perfect balance, in my opinion. There are definitely things that we can really criticize about the film, especially kind of like white feminism and every issue around intersectional identities in the film. I think there's so much to talk about and really get critical about in positive and negative ways. But for what it is and what it does, I think it really struck an amazing balance to be able to reach the audience that it ended up doing.
Yeah, I think it's as I said already a couple of times, it's a really clever film because it has a critique of Barbie without actually directly criticizing or showing Barbie in a negative. It shows Barbie as a toy, as fake. I mean, the whole drinking the drink, and you know, it shows it. You know, she doesn't walk down the stairs because she can be moved over. The pool is kind of, you walk over it because it's not really. So it kind of plays with that kind of toy world and critiques that rather than presenting Barbie in negative ways as a kind of real person, I feel like. So I think it kind of plays with that kind of self-reflexivity brilliantly.
Yeah, I would say that it doesn't critique the doll much at all. It 100% critiques society's use and advertising and perspectives on and parodies of the doll as a representative of women's bodies. Like you could even almost take Barbie out of it and it would still be a great film if it was just about like a child's toy. It didn't need the brand marketing to be a brilliant critique on the way we superimpose our own societal standards and expectations of women onto toys. That the things that we bring from our real world into our escapist imaginary play, like that's what the film is about how controversial our own views of ourselves are, that we bring them into imaginary situations. That's the problem. It just really did a phenomenal job of doing that by using the real world example of the Barbie brand.
There's this wonderful, it's a throwaway line, I think Will Ferrell has it, where they're sitting in the boardroom and you just overhear them say, I think it's Sparkles. Sparkles. Nothing says female autonomy like Sparkles. It has loads of those little subtle moments where you kind of just laugh at it. I see that representation of femininity, but the way also the femininity is used to construct masculinity is important, because this film kind of deconstructs masculinity. The whole fight on the beach parody, with the tennis rackets thing, it's such a laugh of obviously the big battles and things like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. But also, I mean, the men and the board members, Will Ferrell, they're like children. They're children in grown-up suits. It really presents them in that kind of way. And then obviously it picks up, and I don't know how much Mattel liked this, but it picks up that kind of 50s image of the kind of organization man with the kind of the grey Mattel, kind of cubicles and kind of the meek kind of castrated kind of male workers. So again, it's playing with a lot of American tropes and stereotypes of gender in there. I do wish the film had a little bit more of at least one positive male, because all the males largely are vacuous or ridiculous. Even Gloria's husband is kind of clearly a space gator. He's kind of his own planet. But it is ultimately a film about women and the problems and that women face. So maybe there are plenty of films out there that present women in stereotypical ways. So I don't think I could complain too much. But I think in terms of gender equality for the 21st century, I think it would have been nice to see at least one fleshed out kind of male. But maybe in Barbie too.
I was going to say Alan, but he's not very fleshed out.
Alan, well, he's kind of the nod to the gay stereotype. I know he's the gay stereotype. He's also kind of the kind of milk toast stereotype as well, the henpecked husband stereotype. So, or you could even see him as a critique of the new man, But as I said, maybe Barbie too.
Yeah, and then I guess we'll have the podcast sequel right there lined up with Barbie too. But I think as we kind of bring this particular sort of episode to a close, I'm just keen to get your final thoughts on what you think sort of makes Barbie so enduring and relevant. What are we now, sort of 65 years since the toy was released, and it's still arguably as popular as it ever was. Why do you both think that is?
Marketing.
Yeah.
Me personally, marketing. If you think of brands like Barbie or even something like Coca-Cola, they don't really need to advertise anymore, do they? They're huge, but they still keep pumping out the adverts, and they still keep going. So, yeah, marketing is very important to these guys.
And with marketing, I would say that just enduring IP. There are over 40 animated films of Barbie that have been released since 2001. That's an insane number. That's just absurd. And there are a bunch of television shows. There are countless types of dolls. I think there are over 40 different types of Barbie dolls on the market worldwide at the moment. They just keep pumping stuff out. There are books, there are other toys that aren't the iconic doll. There's video games, tons of stationery, and the Barbie core that started last year. The whole fashion trend of Barbie core, and like TikTok is obsessed with Barbie, or at least they have been for the last year or so. Like it's the marketing and the constant updating of new IP, new accessories to buy, new things, all under the umbrella of the main Barbie.
And I think as well, I mean, despite how problematic, and we've talked about the problems of Barbie representation, she also does change, you know, with the times, you know, and keep up with the latest trends and technologies. And, you know, we can't overlook nostalgia here as well. So, because most toys are connected in some ways to nostalgia.
Yeah, and the industry around sort of memorabilia and sort of collectible items is like huge, right? So
there are business problems. I mean, this is why Barbie needs to keep diversifying, because there are business problems. I mean, the Bratz dolls were a major competition to Barbie. Things like Monster High have been major competitions to Barbie. So, yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily all plain sailing.
Yeah. Yeah, and yet, you know, it's still Barbie that seems to sort of lead that pack. I think it's almost set itself above the rest of the competition, as it's sort of become the sort of the default that new products sort of either align to or differentiate from and are compared to in one way or another, right?
It's been around for a long time. So.
Yeah. Right, well, I'd love to keep talking about this, but I think we have to wrap up this episode. Thank you both so much to Jon and Vaughn for joining me, and anyone listening. If you want to find out more, I'm going to put some links in the show notes so that you can read, watch and obsess over Barbie if you really want, so check out those. If anyone wants to connect with you both, where can they do that? Vaughn?
I am on Substack with a newsletter called Review Roulette, and on Twitter at Vaughn Joy.
And Jon?
And in a much more boring way through the University of East Anglia web pages.
Nothing wrong with that. And you can find me on X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it at This Is The Hef, and on LinkedIn as well. Just search for Liam Heffernan because that's my name. And if you enjoy the podcast, just leave us a rating and a review wherever you're listening to this, because it will really help us out and help other people find it. And also, if you give it a follow, all future episodes will appear in your feed. And finally, if you don't already, head on over to Patreon. You can support us for free, or you can even pay, which would be awesome. And there's loads of bonus stuff on there for you to enjoy. Thanks so much for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.